Hello everybody. Welcome to the John Cain Lunch for June 2024. And I'm coming to you today, if you're joining us from home, and welcome here to the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their many generations of custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects also to the elders of the lands that you may be on if you're coming to us from home. I am delighted on this chilly but bright Melbourne day to welcome to talk to you today Dr. Jennifer Rayner about her new essay, Climate Clangers, The Bad Ideas Blocking Real Action. And what a day to talk about that, given the Coalition's announcement this morning. We do have these essays for sale, as we often do at these events. They're $19.95 and you can get them from Meredith at the end of the session, and I'm sure Jen would be happy to sign some for you if you want her to. These are terrific little essays. I was just saying they're almost a perfect length for the read on the flight from Melbourne to Canberra. They don't quite last you all the way to Sydney, but they're very handy like that. Jen is Head of Advocacy at the Climate Council, a very important role at the moment. It's an independent, people-powered organisation advocating for climate science and solutions. And Jen has also been a Chief of Staff and a Senior Policy Advisor in federal and state politics, including working for our good friend Andrew Leigh. And she's also always had a focus on advancing a positive climate agenda across the spectrum of government activity. I can highly recommend to you her second book, which I think is about 5 years ago now, Jen, Blue Collar Freight, which is a really excellent read about the impact of the climate change transition and of technological change more generally on blue-collar workers across Australia, something of great interest to us at Per Capita through the Centre for New Industry. So please make very welcome Dr. Jennifer Rayner.
Just get myself set up here. Oh, it's not going to work. See if I can clip it to something like that. Yeah. How's that going to go? You give me a hand. Sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay. So you reckon just up here?
I'll just pose for a minute.
There you go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all here today. Thank you so much to Per Capita for hosting this wonderful event, and it's really lovely that you have come out in person. One of the best things I think about the post-COVID period is that we are able to come together in person again, so really appreciate you making the time. Climate Clangers is not one of those books that makes an urgent and important case for doing more to tackle climate change. There's absolutely no question that we have to, but you already know that. You know that with the world having warmed by around 1.2 degrees so far, we're all suffering for it. You might be a parent who is wondering about the extreme heat and dangerous bushfires and watching that turn the seasons of summer that you used to enjoy as a kid into real seasons of anxiety for your own children. Maybe you're a community leader and you're battling with the floods and the fires and the repeated unnatural disasters which are threatening lives and livelihoods in your own community. Or you might be a business owner and you're already paying more for insurance than you can afford, wondering about whether the next big disaster is the one that shuts you down for good. Whoever you are, you know that we've lived through the last few years of escalating risks and extremes, and so you know full well that climate change is already harming us here and now. And you can see that worse is on the way if we don't rapidly cut climate pollution this decade by phasing out coal, oil and gas, which are the main drivers of the climate crisis. And because you know this, because so many of us know this, it is really infuriating and perplexing that we are not currently taking action at anything like the speed and scale the science demands. We're building more solar and more clean wind than ever before, but we're still also burning more fossil fuels than ever before. We've started buying electric vehicles and we're rolling those out as fast as possible, but carbon pollution from our cars is going up anyway. We're letting these whole industries off the hook on the notion that they are hard to abate and not therefore having to do anything at all about their emissions. Frankly, the steps that we're taking to build a cleaner economy and move beyond fossil fuels are just much too incremental for the nature of the challenge we face now. Why? In the book, Climate Clangers, available now, I argue that there are 3 bad ideas which are holding us back from taking action at the speed and scale the science demands. You can think of them as perspectives or as conceptual frameworks that usually go unsaid because they're so embedded in how politicians and policymakers and business people, and maybe even some of you here today, see and understand the world. They're an inbuilt set of blinkers which cuts off the full view of what is necessary and what is possible for tackling climate change right now. So we're going to put those three ideas under the spotlight today so we can see if we can break their spell, and you can take that out into your own communities, into the conversations that I know you're all having about climate action around the country now. The first of the three ideas is that our economy has to keep growing as fast as it always has as we decarbonise. There's this almost fetishistic belief from our policymakers and others that to be a thriving and prosperous country, we have to keep marching forward with gross domestic product, quarter over quarter, year after year. That idea is a major handbrake on the root and branch renewal that we need of Australia's economy to drive down climate pollution now. The second of these bad ideas is that net zero accounting can keep global heating within survivable limits. This is the notion that some industries and some companies can keep polluting as usual if someone somewhere else does something like plant a tree or install some renewable energy to offset that pollution on paper. That whole concept is based on a really flawed understanding of the way carbon pollution cycles through our natural world and causes the dangerous heating that's already doing us so much harm. But big polluters have grabbed hold of that idea with both hands and shoved it centre stage in our national conversation about what climate action looks like. And finally, there is the idea that taking necessary action on climate change now would cost us more than we can afford. That assumes that the costs of action now will be greater than the costs of inaction in the future. But with climate-fueled extreme weather disasters already costing us about $143 billion globally a year, it's becoming increasingly clear that that is just simply wishful thinking. So we need better ways of tracking the costs on both sides of the ledger so that we can make clear there's only one smart investment now. In my day job with the Climate Council, I spend more time than is probably healthy, if I'm honest, talking to politicians and decision makers and other very important people, very serious people, about climate action. And people tell me all the time why it is simply not possible to move at the speed and scale the science demands. They say we can't end fossil fuels while ever someone's out there willing to buy them. They say we need least cost abatement to get business and markets moving. They say, of course, they would like to do more, but it's going to have to wait until better budgetary times. Whether they realise it or not, these decision makers are really bound up, and these decision makers with their hands on the levers of power are bound up in these wrong ideas about how climate action, how our economy, and how the natural science of climate change works. They're shaping the range of solutions that decision makers can imagine about climate action and defining the world that they can see on the other side of the transition that we need to take. And fundamentally, it's leading them to overlook or to dismiss out of hand entirely some of the very necessary and possible solutions that we have available now. The longer that we leave these ideas unchallenged, and as the world keeps warming around us, the more dangerous these ideas actually become. So we have to dismantle them in order to get on with the real thinking and the real action that's going to matter now. So taking the first of those, this idea that our economy has to keep marching forward in GDP terms, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, the concept of using GDP as an indicator of our economic well-being has always been a little bit strange because it's simply a measure of production. It's just a measure of everything that gets produced here and sold for money. And the interesting thing about that is that Australia's contribution to, or Australia's GDP, has always been juiced by the contribution of the fossil fuel sector. Because selling fossil fuels is one of the most profitable activities in human history. There are these very large multinational companies in Australia that are extracting coal, oil and gas. They are selling it overseas at a very large profit, and that is part of what gets counted when we add up our national GDP. But the benefits of all of that activity are not experienced here in Australia. They're going to international shareholders, they're going to the CEO of Chevron when he gets a big bonus, they're going to people far from Australia who will never come here and see what our wonderful community has to offer because they're just not part of what the well-being of Australians actually involves. And GDP is also affected by what we consume here at home in our currently very fossil fuel dominated economic system. Household consumption is about half of all GDP, so the choices that we make in our own homes are a really clear indicator of what GDP is going to look like, but it also then makes very clear how that is going to change as we start decarbonising our economy. So think about your home energy bill, for example. At the moment, the average bill ranges from around $1,200 to about $2,000 around Australia. If you buy your electricity in the energy market, then you're buying it from a retailer, they're buying it from a generator. That generator is probably having to buy coal because about 60% of the power in our grid today still comes from coal. And every one of those transactions, those market-based transactions, adds up to what we count when we count GDP. But if you put solar on your roof, as 1 in 3 Australians already have, that picture changes entirely. You're no longer engaging in this whole series of market-based transactions in order to meet your fundamental energy needs. But you're not worse off, you're better off, because you've got power in your own hands, you've got solar on the roof, and your bills are coming down. So that's bad for GDP, but it's great for Australians. And as soon as we start looking at all the ways we need to genuinely decarbonise our economy, we can see there are lots and lots of examples like this. If you get an electric vehicle or you take shared and active transport more often, you're paying less for fuel, less for maintenance for your car, but you're not worse off, you're better off. So to deeply and permanently cut climate pollution, we need to take steps like that everywhere, right across our economy. As we do that, it may well be the case that GDP, that economic measure, stagnates. It might even go backwards at times. In our current thinking about the economy, that is a 4-alarm fire. That is a crisis for our Treasurer, that is a crisis for the government. But with deep decarbonisation, our economy can contract on that particular metric, while Australians keep prospering and in fact get better off. So in the book, I've argued that there's really 2 things we should be using instead to track the health of a clean decarbonising economy. The first is employment. Having a good job is the foundation of a good life. Being able to provide for yourself, to provide for your family, to feel secure about the future, often depends on whether you or the people in your family have a good job. So that is the thing we should care most about as the test for success of a thriving decarbonised economy. There's every reason to be optimistic that we can easily pass that test as we phase out fossil fuels and phase up their clean alternative. There's around 618,000 jobs that are directly associated on the front line of fossil fuels today in Australia. And that's taking quite an expansive definition, including not just people who are involved in things like mining of coal and gas, but also people who work in transport and shipping and our petrol stations and kind of anywhere where there is an involvement directly with fossil fuels. There was a study done recently by a big consortium of universities called the Net Zero Australia study, which said we'll need a skilled workforce of something like 700 or 800,000 people to fully deliver Australia's net zero transformation. So that is well more than the number of jobs that are on the front line of fossil fuels today. The Australian Government's Jobs and Skills Agency says we're going to need 42,000 more electricians just in the next 7 years to accelerate the rollout that is underway and reach the national target of 82% renewables. And we're already seeing that job creation in action. If you've been to Gladstone or Townsville or out to the west recently, there are big companies that are taking this transition seriously, like Twiggy Forrest, Korea Zinc. These are big global firms which are rolling out clean energy and clean industry at scale, and it is already creating great new jobs in regional communities right around Australia. Now, of course, a decarbonised economy isn't a kibbutz, so someone does have to create those jobs, which is why the other thing we should care about if we look at the health of a clean economy is business investment. We need to keep that ticking along because starting a new business or expanding your business is really directly related to the creation of new jobs. Research in Australia and internationally has consistently shown that new firms are account for the vast majority of job creation, with small and medium businesses being particularly jobs rich. So embracing employment and business investment as the metrics that matter for a clean economy really starts to free us up to think differently about what we need to do now. The question becomes, what can we do to create enough good jobs for everyone who wants one, and an environment that encourages businesses to invest in low and zero emission industries to make those jobs? That's a materially different matter than trying to make sure that our GDP metric keeps moving forward at historic growth rates forever. And when governments and policymakers redefine their task in those terms, then it unlocks new possibilities that might be not able to be conceptualised today. Perhaps most importantly, it can light an accelerated pathway to the phase out of fossil fuels, particularly from our exports, by prioritising the creation of good new jobs in thriving long-term industries in Australia, not just that one-to-one replacement of GDP. Shifting gears slightly to the second of our clangers, I wanted to ask you all to just pop a little thought experiment for me for a minute. If you tip out a bin full of rubbish in your local park while your neighbour builds a backyard compost plant for theirs, is there still mouldy vegetables blowing around the swings? How about if you cheat on your partner while your best friend promises to be faithful to theirs? You still deserve the cold shoulder at home? If you scull 6 pints and the bartender makes some lemonade, are you net sober? The idea of net accounting for social ills is completely ridiculous in almost all contexts, as those rather facetious, I admit, examples point out. But at the moment, the prevailing way we are thinking about climate action in Australia is based on logic as dodgy as being net sober. We're embedding this concept of carbon accounting based on offsets in so much of our thinking about how corporates, how countries, how individuals are conceptualising their contribution to climate pollution and what it takes to reduce it. This idea of carbon accounting comes from the natural world and this idea of sources and sinks. So in our environment, some things are natural sources of emissions, things like burping cows or volcanoes. Others are natural sinks like trees, which can absorb the carbon and store it. And carbon normally flows through these sinks and cycles in a natural cycle, which is relatively continuous, with a stable cycle, as a stable climate, as long as they are relatively balanced. The problem is we've thrown that balance completely out of fossil fuels into the atmosphere than we could ever naturally balance with natural sinks. Where carbon offsets come in then is that they're like a token for pollution. One carbon offset is usually 1 tonne of climate pollution. And big corporations have been extremely successful at convincing governments and the community that buying these offsets deals with their problematic pollution. Unfortunately, there's 3 problems which explain why that's simply not going to work. You can think of these as storage, surplus, and sources. 3 S's. Storage is the most fundamental issue. When we burn fossil fuels, we draw up stored carbon from the deep underground and release it into the active carbon cycle in our atmosphere. Drawing it down into a tree, for example, doesn't lock that carbon back away underground again. It keeps cycling in the active part of our upper atmosphere. You can think of it a bit like pouring sand into a sandbox that's already full. If you shape some of it into little castles, it doesn't actually take the sand back out of the box again. There's also a terrible concern that when we plant trees to store carbon, for example, those trees are very vulnerable to being burned down again a few years later in an unnatural disaster that's been fueled by climate change. The second problem is technically called additionality, but that doesn't start with S. So in the book, I've called it surplus, which basically is, did the thing happen that was additional to what would have happened anyway, or are you just describing something that would have happened anyway? If you plant some trees as you're part of building up your lovely farm as an agricultural land manager, and you were doing that because you thought those trees were great and you really wanted to have a nice wooded landscape, that's awesome and that's a fantastic thing to do. But if you were doing that anyway and then you sold some offsets for it, you have not added to the stock of storage for carbon that there is in our total community. And this is one of the biggest problems with offsets at the moment, is that there's an emerging wealth of research indicating that projects which have sold offsets either didn't do the thing at all, or they didn't do anything that was additional to what would have happened anyway. And the third problem, I think, is sometimes the easiest one to grapple with, which is where is all the land going to come from for these offsets? Land to grow trees doesn't grow on, you get it. Land is a really scarce commodity in its own right. There was some analysis done which looked at the current national pledges of major countries around the world through the UN Climate Convention to look at the extent to which they are relying on offsets to meet their promised reductions in emission. They found that those offsets would require over 1 billion hectares of land, which is more than the combined land area of the European Union, India, South Africa, and Turkey together. So it's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be possible to plant trees on a land mass that size. And the idea that big industrials, big polluters can't already be taking really practical, really direct steps to cut their climate pollution is, to be totally blunt, bullshit. Climate Council recently did a piece of work called Seize the Decade, where we looked at what was possible with solutions and technologies already available today to cut climate pollution right across our economy. We found that it is entirely possible to cut climate pollution 75% this decade and get on track for net zero by 2035 by doing the things we know that work. Rolling out clean energy, using energy more efficiently, electrifying our cars, using shared and active transport more often, electrifying our homes. It is possible to do an awful lot right now, and what we should be holding industries and polluters accountable for are those genuine actions. Because in this make or break decade for action, it is the genuine cuts to climate pollution that are the ones that count now. So the headline change that we should be making is to set aside this idea of net carbon accounting for now and focus on making genuine permanent cuts to climate pollution. It may be the case as we get much closer to real zero that there is a small share of our climate pollution we can't yet deal with for technology reasons or because there's a piece of that we really require. But we can get very close, and we should be working to get as close as possible to real zero as we can, and we should be tracking our progress in those terms. It shouldn't even be that difficult for companies to do, because if they can tell you what their emissions are in a net basis, they can tell you what their emissions are without the offsets. So it should actually be very straightforward. Politically contentious, but very straightforward. We also need stronger anti-greenwashing laws to prevent companies from being able to make claims about their net zero pathway, their good climate action, where that is based entirely on offsetting. And there's really positive momentum happening on that in places like the European Union at the moment, where they have recently banned advertising claims about carbon neutrality or net zero or green, which are based entirely on the purchase of offsets. We also need to think about updating some of our national policy settings like the safeguard mechanism, which is the federal government's main lever for driving down pollution from our biggest industrial emitters. At the moment, they can use as many offsets as they like to deal with their climate pollution, but that simply shouldn't be the case. And we need to apply this same standard to governments as well as just to companies. Australia currently accounts for our climate pollution on a net basis. 43% will be a net 43. If we get to net zero by 2050, that will be a net number with a significant amount of pollution probably still on the other side of it. So we need to actually be accounting for the gross emissions reduction that we are achieving. And the next nationally determined target that we set in 2035 would be a really great place to start in bringing that new level of transparency. Some of these changes would be contentious, but they're also pretty hard to argue with. Who could be against telling Australians the truth about what companies are or aren't doing to keep them safe from runaway climate change? Or requiring companies that are already promising to be net zero to actually prove it? The third clanger I wanted to talk about is the cost of inaction. And again, I have a question for you. Is $1 billion a lot of money? Is $1 trillion a lot of money? The only sensible answer to that question, of course, is it depends. It depends what you're spending it on. Doing anything of substance at a big national scale often involves spending that kind of money, but we might have different judgments about the worthiness of that spend, for example. If you spend $1 billion boosting teacher numbers or nurses on the front line, that's arguably a great investment. You spend $1 billion on self-promotional advertising like the last coalition government did, we might think that that is a less good spend. The challenge at the moment is that the expected costs of climate action are very, very visible. We hear about them all the time. If you opened a paper today, somewhere you probably saw something about what it's going to cost us to transition to cleaner energy, to avoid dangerous climate change. But we very, very rarely hear about the costs of inaction that sit on the other side of that. We also don't talk enough about the BAU cost of continuing to run our economy and how much all of that can either contribute to our clean transition or keep making the problem worse. Again, the Net Zero Australia study did some interesting research on this. They estimated that the cost of getting to net zero would range from somewhere between 4.8 trillion and 5.1 trillion. Is that a big number? Compared to what? in looking at one of their scenarios, which assumed we didn't take climate action, that we just continued as we were going along our merry way, replacing our coal-fired generators, replacing our petrol cars, continuing to power ourselves as we do today, they estimated the cost of that would be $4.3 trillion. So actually not that much less than the cost of genuine climate action. And the point is, we are going on some of this pathway anyway. Our ageing and unreliable coal-fired generators are closing. They will have to be replaced. Our homes and our cars and all of the different parts of our economy over the next 25 years will need to be replaced, upgraded, retrofitted, changed. Some of us will be spending that money anyway in our own lives. Businesses will spend some of that, governments will spend some of that, and it's all happening one way or another. The real question is just, do we pour that investment into things that make a difference, or do we keep doing what we're doing and cooking the planet in the process? So this question about how much is it going to cost needs much better information on the other side to understand the cost of business as usual. Because the costs of business as usual are also not just those direct financial costs. They are the costs of our inaction in the huge and escalating price we will all pay from more unnatural weather disasters, which the Insurance Council of Australia estimates will cost about $35 billion a year by 2050 if we keep going on our current path. It will be felt in the loss of major industries like agriculture and tourism, which contribute about $78 billion worth of meat and vegetables and very crucially wine around the country last year. And the extreme weather that is fueled by climate change is also incredibly bad for our health. So during those really anxious few weeks of the Black Summer bushfires a few years ago, presentations to our emergency departments and to GPs for respiratory and heart issues spiked. And that's been estimated just to cost $1.9 billion for a few weeks of bushfire period. So it's honestly quite difficult to overstate just how massive the costs and the consequences of global heating are going to be if we don't get it under control soon. Australia at 2 degrees or 3 degrees of warming is just going to be radically and catastrophically different from the world we live in today. And we should be pricing all of that in. We should be thinking about those costs of inaction as we are making plans today. I think there's a couple of different ways that we should be doing this to quantify the costs of business as usual and make sure that that is properly communicated to the Australian community. One is that we should actually estimate that full cost, what inaction would cost us, and publish that in our budget papers. That way the government can show investments that it is making to deal with climate change now as reducing that forward liability rather than as big costs, which is how they get presented as today. It's a way to change the political incentives and make very visible the thing we're actually working towards, which is avoiding more cost, avoiding more harm to lives and livelihoods. We also need a social cost of carbon to be embedded across deciding on an infrastructure project or a policy or an investment in our energy system. We need like the big 4 consulting firms, for example, to be applying that in all the advice that they give to corporates so that it is really clear and really transparent how the cost of our actions today will make a difference tomorrow. And finally, I think we need to really clearly and transparently explain to Australians how much of the change we need can just come from the choices that all of us will make as we go about our lives over the next 25 years. Building and buying and upgrading the stuff you have now will be part of the action that we need to take to get to a cleaner, safer Australia. And so helping people to understand where those opportunities are and helping people understand how much of a role that can play is really essential to driving the right kind of cost calculus when we're making those choices. I do think that humans are pretty notorious for our bias towards short-term decision-making. And there's really no better example of that than this obsession with balancing budgets today at the cost of our safe climate future. So evening out that information asymmetry that there is in our public debate is a really important way to break through the bias so that we can recognise that it's inaction that's costing us now, not action. So that's a bit of an overview of the things that the book covers, but I wanted to just really hold on the idea that some truths are hard, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to face them. And one hard truth about tackling climate change is that we can't do it half-assed from here. We've frankly left it too long. We've let the risks mount too high for gradual and for incremental change to be an option anymore. That's why the 3 climate clangers in this book are such a problem. They're all handbrakes on our momentum at a time when we need to be flipping the switch to warp speed. Each of them is like an insidiously subtle reason for delay. All the more dangerous because the people for whom they are that reason for delay often aren't even aware that they're thinking that way. We can't let bad ideas restrain our actions any further, so it's time to consciously put them aside. Another hard truth is that we can't fix the massive problem of climate change relying on the same economic and political and social structures that got us here in the first place. We're going to have to do things that fundamentally disrupt them, like putting power on the roofs of homeowners and into the hands of communities rather than multinational fossil fuel corporations. Forcing businesses to prioritise cutting their climate pollution over providing their shareholders with more dirty dividends. Investing now and being okay with the fact that the best returns will come in the harm we don't see down the track. We just can't and won't do these things if we keep stubbornly clinging to the same old ideas about how the world should work. We need the creativity to imagine a different Australia and then the courage to go out and build it. I think the hardest truth of all, and certainly one that I think about a lot in my day-to-day work at the Climate Council, is that we face the responsibility and the test of being the last generation where it might actually be possible to fix this mess. Our actions this decade will make the difference between halting harmful warming or seeing it accelerate out of all control. Now, we can be angry at the people who ignored the problem for too long, and we can be daunted by the task that's ahead of us, but fundamentally there's nothing else to do but roll up our sleeves and get on with fixing it. Rapidly phasing out fossil fuels, renewing our home and energy system, transforming how we make things, build things, move around. These climate clangers can't be our excuses any longer, the things that we use ourselves to justify more delay. So I think the way that we understand a problem defines the solutions that we can imagine to solve it. It's time to think differently about what a thriving zero-carbon economy actually looks like, differently about the bar that we set for climate action, and the dividends of strong action now. Changing how we think about climate change can make possible things that might feel impossible right now. It can unlock the political and the social capital that is essential to all lasting change and really accelerate Australia's progress towards a clean future in this genuinely make or break decade. Once we put aside these bad ideas that are blocking real action, then we can get on with doing what's necessary. Thank you. Oh, hand up over here already.
Already? All right. Hang on, we'll just... Okay, we're going to take a few questions, a few comments. I think David's pretty keen.
Yes, I'm a troublemaker from way back. I also suffer from having studied meteorology, chemistry and accounting. So all three of those...
You're a laugh at parties, I'm sure.
I've got the kitchen completely covered, you might say. So yeah. Anyway, I was at a presentation, I think it was last year, and Graham Samuel was talking about the problem he was having at home. Somebody arrived to replace the gas supply to his house, and I think it cost $15,000 to do the job. And there's nothing he could do to say, hang on, if you gave me $5,000 of that, if you gave me $2,000, in fact, if you didn't do anything at all, I'll change it over to electricity, just as long as I can get the tradespeople to do it. And there needs to be some sort of, circuit breaker kind of thing there, so you can say, hang on, I don't want somebody coming in and doing this sort of really bad activity just on my doorstep, when for a fraction of the cost I could do something better, or somebody else could do something better.
Are we taking that as a comment? Or is
Take
there a
it as
question?
comment. You can respond to it if you want. But
I think there is absolutely something important about the defaults that we have in place around Australia to make people's choices as easy and painless as possible. Because we know there is just this muck-about factor that comes into play. If you need to replace an appliance, you're getting a new car, you're thinking about all of those different choices in your lives. And we want the low carbon, the zero carbon option to be the easiest and quickest and the safest default for people. Which is why at Climate Council we do advocate for things like requiring all new homes to be built all electric, or for gas appliances to be replaced with electric alternatives when they reach end of life. Because those kind of defaults just make it really easy for people to go, oh, okay, I've got to replace my hot water service, I've got to replace my stove. What's out there? Oh, okay, electric induction stoves are out there and everybody knows how to install them. Great, I'm in, let's go. So I think those kind of defaults are an important lever in policy for making it as easy and as painless as possible.
Yes, microphone here.
Oh, look, thank you. Fabulous talk. I'm buying the book and so on. The thing that I was wondering about is that in the imaginary of how we change the economy, we're imagining big employers, big companies, but in fact the major employers in Australia are small business, whose capacity to manoeuvre and shift their costs is very limited. The second thing is that throwing through everything is the exorbitant cost of land, which distorts the whole economy, and where the actual money of the economy is sucked into being static asset value. So we've actually got very little cash flow. And the same problem occurs with housing, that the imaginary, there are all these slum landlords who own loads of property, and they're in fact, retired factory workers who bought a property in their 40s and thought it would see them through their old age, and then discover that they can't get the pension because they've got this little house that they rent out and they can't afford anymore to maintain it. And if they sell it, that's one less rental property in the market, and they can't get the pension for another 5 years. Now there's all these complicating factors of how in fact our economy and our society is constructed of huge numbers of people doing things in a small scale, held back by the cost of their rent and their property, and the fact that their actual cash flow and profit margins are quite small. We're not battling the big companies. That's just one element. That's the easy part. So what are your thoughts on that?
So to your point about, who goes first and where do we start looking first, about 28% of Australia's emissions come from just over 200 companies, fossil fuels, gas, cement producers, that kind of thing. So I say we start there because, companies like Shell are making multi-billion-dollar profits, Woodside, Santos, those sorts of firms, they have the capital, they have the balance sheets, they have the know-how, they have the people, they have everything except the will to do this transition. So I think making those big companies do what they can is really important, and we should never let them off the hook at the expense of focusing on individual action or what people can do. It is then absolutely true that there is a big share of the pollution that comes from the economy that is not from those big companies, and it is the aggregate of all of the small and medium businesses, the aggregate of all of our homes, all the choices that we do make, as I was saying a minute ago. And I think frankly the answer to that a lot of the time is government. So I'm from the ACT. We worked on a really good scheme which has been very popular in the ACT to give people zero interest loans for the upfront cost of electrifying their homes and making them more efficient. So people will save on their bills once they have solar on the roof or a battery or the electric stove, but they can't access those savings until they've already made that upfront investment, which is where government comes in. And so I do think this is a time where governments need to think big about what the role that they can play in all of this is. And we are seeing that now from the federal government with their last two budgets. There's been quite a lot of new investment in things that will get us over the hump of either people and communities being able to take this transition or new industries being able to scale up and grow here. So that is the kind of thinking that I think we need a lot more of. They just need to go much bigger at it, which is where that point about allowing some of those investments to be presented as reductions in future climate risk is actually really helpful, because at the moment what they feel like they can do is very constrained by, can we balance the budget? Well, how are we balancing that enormous looming liability that's coming if we don't get climate change under control?
Thank you. Excellent point. Wow.
Once again, thanks for your talk. It's great. I'm really interested on one level the federal scene, but the local government situation. And have you got any thoughts on ways in which local government itself can really promote climate action? I think at the moment we're getting a lot of lip service, but not a lot of action.
Local governments are a really important part of this story, and I think sometimes their contribution does get a bit overlooked with the feds and the state governments as well. I mean, the first and most impactful thing that often local governments can do is to be electrifying or changing over their own operations. So most swimming pools, for example, in Australia are council-owned facilities, and they run on gas for heating them. Councils have big fleets which they can be electrifying. They can put solar panels on the roofs of all those community facilities that they own. So there are quite practical things that local governments can do, and that leading ones around the country, particularly in our big cities, are already doing. I think also then there's a big conversation to have with their communities about what are the other actions that community might want to take together. So things like community batteries, for example, are becoming a big part of the conversation about how we might soak up all that solar that's already on everybody's roofs during the day when it's not actually being used because there's too much of it. How do we store that and use it in the evening later in the day? But it doesn't always make sense for everyone in a community to have a battery on their own home. So things like coordinating community batteries is a really practical contribution local governments can make. And if you're on a local government, because I know this is that sort of crowd, or you are actively engaged with your local government, I really encourage you to be talking to them about what they are doing. Like, are they taking all of the available steps, like the ones I've just mentioned, to fix their own operations first, and then how are they engaging with their communities about what they can do next?
Excellent point. Like that. Grayson.
Hi, thank you again for coming and speaking. It was very insightful. Look, this is a bit outside of my knowledge base, climate change stuff. So this is a good faith question, though I am genuinely curious. Given the global nature of climate change and the fact that it affects the entire world, in relation to the cost of inaction about natural disasters that occur because of climate pollution, would us decarbonising actually have that much of an effect on reducing those natural disasters, and how does that sort of work?
So every community around the world needs to be doing as much as they can to slash climate pollution is the first answer, because this is, as you say, a global problem, and we need to all move together as much as we can, recognising the different contributions and capabilities that different countries have. One of the reasons at Climate Council we recommend that Australia slashes climate pollution by 75% by 2030 is because we are a rich country that has the ability to do that with these unparalleled resources in wind and solar. Not every country has that, and therefore not every country may be able to do as much as we can. Not every country has made as much of a contribution to the problem through our fossil fuel exports as well. So I think that the first point to say is that we do all need to move together, but Australia's decarbonisation has the potential to avoid climate pollution well beyond our shores. And one of the best examples of that is growing new industries in things like green manufacturing, green metals, green energy. Because at the moment, we pollute a lot in Australia by digging up fossil fuels and sending them to China, and digging up things like iron ore and sending that to China, where they make steel that then produces an awful lot of climate pollution over there as well. If we are successful in this Future Made in Australia vision that the Prime Minister has started to sketch out, we will instead produce things like green steel or intermediate products to it here in Australia using clean energy, which we have more of and can produce more cheaply than most other countries can. And we will sell them that product instead. So we've cut our own pollution at home and we've cut it at their end. So there's this double opportunity of Australia's decarbonisation, and particularly of phasing out our fossil fuel exports, to make a far bigger contribution to global climate change than just what we would do here at home. Because I think people are often surprised to learn that Australia's fossil fuel exports are actually our biggest contribution to global climate change. They're about twice as much as our domestic pollution. So being able to act on both of those things will play a really big role in helping us create that safer world.
I'm actually following on from that last question, because I think we do have to think globally, and I do have some concerns that with Donald Trump is coming in America, and the far right in Europe, and here, that the concern is that whatever we do, we are really going to have to look more at mitigation, the effects of climate change, rather than just dealing with it and trying to prevent it, because we're going to live, whether we like it or not, in a world that is going to be at least 2 degrees hotter. And I'm just sort of wondering what the ideas are from climate change, and also what your interactions are with similar organisations overseas.
It's a really important point. I think the first thing to say is there is so much momentum about the transition that's happening now around the world and in Australia. Like I said before, 40% of the power in our main national grid already comes from renewables. 1 in 3 Australians have solar on the roof, and more people are getting it all the time because they're not listening to what Peter Dutton has to say. They're listening to their neighbour who got it and thinks it's great because it's cutting their power bills in half. So there is a certain momentum that all of this has at the moment, which is moving forward of its own volition now, and I think we can definitely continue to accelerate, and some of that can't really be stopped by terrible choices in America or, you know, different policies that people might have around the place, because it is what makes sense for people now. It's what makes sense for people who are looking to get their own cost of living under control. It's what makes sense for businesses that are thinking about whether or not they still want to be here in 20 years' time or 10 years' time. And it makes sense for, as you say, governments who are thinking about how do we avoid some of this harm that is coming down the pipe otherwise. On adaptation, it is important that we prepare communities for living in a hotter world, because there is unfortunately a degree of warming that is now baked in based on the amount of pollution that there is in the atmosphere. But I think that needs to be done very much in a context of walking and chewing gum at the same time, where we can identify the communities that are most vulnerable to those risks, and some of those we are already seeing because they have been hit repeatedly in the past few years by unnatural disasters, particularly flooding. Part of that is also then communities that experience complex disadvantage that might mean that they are much more vulnerable to the impacts of things like extreme heat if they're living in really terrible, under-maintained public housing. So we need to know who those communities are. We need to be thinking and working very hard to help them adapt. But that cannot be at the expense of doing everything we can to slash climate pollution now, because it won't just be 2 degrees of warming if we don't. It'll be 3 degrees, 4 degrees beyond. And that's an unimaginably different world.
Just moving from globally to locally, I actually live in a small country town in outback New South Wales. I'm wondering, does the Climate Council have any accurate numbers for the number of Australians, voting Australians, who actually accept climate change and the effects it's going to have? From my small local research, I would say that the majority, and given that it is an ageing population, because it's a town where farmers retire to, my impression is that in my local area, people don't accept it at all. They just say, we've always had hot summers, we've always had cold winters, we've always had floods, we've always had... So I'm wondering, because those people are the voters, and what governments want is to be returned to power. So they don't want to upset the voters.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's really lovely to have you with us, and I hope this feels like a space where you are among like-minded people. The evidence is pretty clear, I think, from the last federal election, which was Australia's first climate election, and clear from the polling which has consistently come in since then, that a clear majority of Australians want more action on climate. A clear majority of Australians understand the risks that we face. They want governments to do things about it, and they increasingly recognise that things like nuclear or offsets or CCS are just not going to get us where we need to go. So I understand, and we hear all the time, a lot of that ongoing conversation about whether or not climate change is even real. I think what we find in our work, though, is that that is a small and declining part of the conversation, and particularly as more Australians have experienced the very direct harms of a changing climate around them. In the past few years, we've seen communities right around Australia either being disrupted by floods or by fires that were turbocharged by climate change. That has really changed minds. That has helped people understand that this is beyond anything that we've experienced before, anything beyond those, historic extremes that people often like to cite, and that more is on the way if we don't cut climate pollution now. We have a project or a partner organisation at Climate Council called Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, which is headed up by a gentleman you might be familiar with called Greg Mullins, very, very impressive former fire services chief. And he and his organisation spend a lot of time in regional Australia talking to communities about some of these issues. And he has a particular reflection. He's been fighting fires for something like 50 years, although you wouldn't know it from looking at him. And he talks about just the incredible ferocity and extreme extremity of the fires that they see now. They're not anything like the fires that they were fighting when he first started out, because they've been turbocharged by all the climatic conditions. And so some of those things about, well, we've always had fires, or he will say, we've never had fires like this. And you have not seen the ferocity of the fires that we are experiencing now, and that will continue to get worse. So I think it is important to find the right voices to go and chat to those people and talk about the things that are going to resonate most to them, because I'm sure some of those people might be, local firefighter volunteers. They're people who know their communities well, but asking about some of those reflections around, well, maybe we have had fires, but were they always like this? Maybe we have had droughts, but did they always last this long? What was the former flood peak? How much worse is it getting now? Helping people to start reflecting back on some of that time, particularly if they're older people, can sometimes be a useful into that conversation.
I may have a particularly dark turn of mind, but now we're thinking nuclear a lot. It strikes me that it would only take 3 little nuclear bombs to get rid of Australia's coal export industry. You only have to knock out Hay Point, Abbott Point and Newcastle. And if you knock out Darwin and a couple of places in WA, you get rid of the gas export. That, of course, is unthinkable until such time as a major world power suddenly gets scared of climate change and wishes to bring that into its real politic. Do you think that this has been brought to the notice of the security establishment?
It's an interesting hypothetical. It makes me think of the other day I was driving with my son and he heard something on the radio that upset him about the climate progress and that kind of thing, because he's 13 and lots of things upset him at the moment. And his observation was, so when do we start with the eco-terrorism? Is that a 5-year thing? Is that a 10-year thing? When does the eco-terrorism kick in? And I said to him, in all seriousness, mate, there are really good people of goodwill and good intent who are working really, really hard to fix this problem. And we just don't want to get to a point where that is necessary, because there is so much that we can do, so much that we're working to do. So trust the adults in your life, trust the people that you believe in to be able to deal with and solve some of these problems. And I think there's also kind of a broader conversation that we need to have about looking to the real solutions with hope, finding the things that we can do and really holding on to them and concentrating on that as the vision, so that we're not necessarily getting to a place where those are the kind of things we're genuinely needing to countenance.
Hello, thank you. If carbon offsets are a scam, how do I assuage my guilt in wanting to fly to Europe to see my family?
It's a really good question, and I think that teases out two interesting things, which is the way that carbon offsets have been really marketed to people as a thing that you can do, a thing that you can do to help the planet, and maybe make yourself feel better when you're doing a thing that you might otherwise have concerns about. I think that with climate action, there are so many different ways that each of us can contribute. There are so many different ways that companies, governments, regions can contribute. Not every one of us will do everything. It won't make sense and it won't be possible for every one of us to do everything. And so what we need to do is find the things that we can do and do those. And it's a little bit like recycling, how, there are some people who are really, really militant about recycling, and they sort every particular thing, and they get really upset when people don't do that themselves, without realizing that that's just not how most people's lives are. And if we can get, 90% of people recycling imperfectly 90% of the time, that's actually heaps better than we would get if only a very small share of people are doing absolutely everything. And so I think on the individual level, that climate action is like that too. Find the things you can do, find the things that are real, that make a real contribution, whether that is, driving an EV or using shared and active transport more often when you are getting around, putting solar on the roof, thinking about, having some meatless meals a couple of times a week, whatever it is that you can do those things that make sense for you, and then you'll be making the contribution. And if all of us, every one of us, does the things that make sense for us, and we get onto those 200 companies that are producing 28% of our climate pollution, then we'll get where we need to go.
I'm going to jump in at this point with a question from David Hind, who's online, and he asks, points out that we've had particularly rancorous politics since at least 2007, have we? Around climate change. Do you believe that a bipartisan commitment is necessary to achieve our goals? And if so, is that even possible?
I'm really encouraged by what we're seeing around Australia at the moment at the state and territory level on climate. There are some great Liberal figures, different jurisdictions around the country who are really embracing the conversation about climate action in a really serious and mature way, who are really recognising that there is stuff that we can and should be getting on with, that if they want to lead their jurisdictions, that is stuff they can and should be getting on with. So the previous New South Wales Liberal government, there's going to be a state election in Queensland later in the year. The LNP up there backed the state government's emissions reduction targets. I think we are seeing a lot more commonality about climate action in Australia, particularly at the state and territory level, and that reflects where the community is. The community is tired of the climate wars. The community is tired of hearing these same arguments trotted out over and over again. They just want their leaders to get on with it. So I think we've seen a little outbreak of it in the past couple of weeks, and we probably will see more of that as we head into the next federal election. But that doesn't fundamentally seem to be where the community is. And when the community is asking for action about a particular thing, eventually all politicians will generally come together to recognise that and to respond to that.
Let's hope so. Last question will come from Margaret McKenzie on our team. Meredith, bring you the mic.
Thank you. This is a quick one, and it's a segue from this lady's point here about the country towns and the attitudes. It's alphas and Zs that are producing the new attitudes. So in schools and stuff, the curriculum have filtered in climate change and stuff in such a way that it certainly wasn't in the older generations. And that's where, and of course they're the ones on the cutting edge too. So that's really where, I don't know, does that sort of consistent with your view about that it's really, that's where the hope and the costs lie. So
I think what we're definitely seeing is that this is a real front of mind issue for younger Australians. You know, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, this is something they are genuinely talking about all the time. And we see this, for example, in our social media channels at Climate Council, where people really want to engage. They want good quality information. They want to know what the solutions are. They want to talk about that, and then they want to take that out and, you know, advocate for that in their communities and with their decision makers. I think a real risk with younger Australians is that sense of like doomerism and despair and the idea that it's too late and it doesn't matter, because that is actually just as bad in some ways as not believing that climate change is a real thing. If you believe it doesn't matter because there's nothing we can do about it, you're not going to be any more motivated to do what you can or vote for parties that are promising to do something than if you don't believe it's a real thing in the first place. And so as someone who is a millennial but now I guess officially a grown-up, I think it's really important that the grown-ups model hope and optimism and solutions and tell a story about what we can do here, tell a story about how we're all working as hard as we can to fix it, so that the younger people in our lives do have that hope and that sense of optimism, and that my son is not asking about eco-terrorism.
Thank you, Jen. We'll leave it there. Please join me in thanking Jen Rayner.
Thank you.
So I would, careful, don't trip. Do a little dance. I would reiterate that you can buy this terrific essay now, so don't all rush forward at once, but Meredith can help you buy them. It is really worth a read. Hope, it's really what that's about, isn't it? It's about hope for the next generation, and if we do rob them of any optimism that they can have a better life, then despair and nihilism will kick in, and as the parent of a young child, that terrifies me. We will be here on the third Wednesday in July, the 17th. Our speaker that day will be Peter Lewis from Essential Media, who's also now on the Per Capita board and is the convener of our Centre of the Public Square. And he'll be talking to you about the work that we're going to do through the public square. One of the things we are very keen to do in this area is use those sort of direct engagement techniques that Peter and Civility have developed, town halls, to talk about the transition and to express and populate to people the work that we're doing in the Centre for New Industry about the benefits of the transition, particularly for some of those regional communities where we're going to need to really win hearts and minds. So do join us next month. I also wanted to say thank you. I know some of you here have already made very generous donations to our end of financial year campaign, fundraising campaign, and I will be writing to those of you who have to say thank you personally. If you haven't and you have the wherewithal in this cost of living crisis, we would always appreciate your support. We're a tiny little organisation, but we try to punch well above our weight. So anything you can do to support us would be very welcome, and thank you very much for those of you who already have. Thanks for coming. See you next month.